with regard to 19th century migrations from India, and that the Tamil migration was part of both these flows of people. Now, typically both flows have been thought of as labor migrations, which in many ways they were. However, if this is what it was for the state and for the employers, that this was labor, that they needed to do all kinds of things, for the people moving, that might not have been their perspective. So for instance, after the 1857 revolt in India against the British state, we saw a marked increase in migrants leaving India precisely to escape arrest or various other, for being involved in the sedition. Okay, so they were not moving merely for labor, but an entirely different impetus, different motivation informed that. Most women who migrated, many women who migrated might have done so to escape a whole host of social strictures and gender regimes in India, or hostile gender regime, and found, as this play demonstrated, found themselves inserted into yet another hostile gender regime. So even though much of what motivated them was to escape from a certain set of social strictures, they found themselves embedded in a new set of social strictures. The gender aspect of these migrations is very, very complex. It's a feminist analysis of it bring up all the issues that confront feminist analysis of labor regimes, in that much of the work, of course, was unremunerated. It was domestic labor. In those instances when it was remunerated, it was paid very poorly. So as a result, women often found that they had to hitch themselves up to some man or the other, again, as referenced in the play, merely to survive. So, this is a very, very complicated web of gender relations that was produced in this 19th century migrations. It was very violent, and a lot of sexual abuse was part and parcel of the system. Now, obviously, these migrations profoundly shaped the economic, political, social landscape in the various destination sites that people ended up in. They also were absolutely critical to shaping the cultural terrain of the various destination sites. So for instance, in the Caribbean, as I'm sure many people are aware, they produce new hybrid music forms like chutney soca, or have produced, have led people to reflect on notions such as the Jahazi pipe as kind of emblematic of human connection or of empathetic connection. In places like the Mauritius, the poet Torabuli has tried to reflect upon what he calls the condition of coolitude, where he's kind of drawing a parallel with negritude. And scholars from Fiji, for instance, have tried to think about the fact that migrants, particularly the state-managed migrants, who called each other and themselves Gilmit, which was basically a version of the word agreement. Okay, so the whole system was supposed to be through a contractual free labor system. The centerpiece of which was an agreement, and Gilmit is the what's the word I'm looking for? The colloquial term, the contamination, whatever of it in Hindi. Okay, so agreement to Gilmit. So people from Bridge Lal, who works on Fiji, have sought to reflect on this thing and see if we can make these into conceptual moments certainly in scholarship. In the early 20th century within India, so this is some of what is going on in the various destination sites. In India in the early 20th century, you had a very profound, very sort of passionate and impassioned, moralistic discourse of gender that erupted around all of these migrants in various colonies, claiming that this was a slur on Indian women. They were treated so badly. They had forgotten their Indian ways. They had more than one husband, or they didn't have a husband. They were sleeping with too many people, etc. And for this reason, indenture should be stopped. So rather than coming up with a progressive notion around migration, now why don't we change the conditions under which people migrate? The argument was, why don't we stop this, the entire practice of migration, because it produces bad Indian women. As several scholars have argued, this was in fact a successful discourse, and indenture was it put an end, abolished. Thank you. We're clearly having a really rough time finding just regular words. Okay, I bring this up because if in the early 20th century you had the moment of these 19th century migrations become so central to Indian politics, and they were very central, by the way, for the father of the Indian nation, Mahatma Gandhi, who was a migrant in South Africa and lived there for 20 years and was involved with the indentured population in varying degrees, and depending on who you read, for good or ill. I bring this up because it's quite startling how now you find very little said about the 19th century migrations within cultural production in India. So while Bollywood, the most influential culture industry in the subcontinent, has spent a lot of time reflecting on the migration, the late 20th century migration to various industrialized countries, the UK, US, Canada, etc. It really has very little to say on the 19th century migrations. However, I think recently one is noticing a little bit of a shift. So for instance, Sneha Khanwalkar, who did the soundtrack for the very, very successful Bollywood film Gangs of Wasseypur, actually went and did some of her research in Trinidad and Tobago in order to try and incorporate elements of Bhojpuri music that she thought had disappeared from India, but she could find traces of it in Trinidad. And perhaps most famously, Amitav Ghosh, the novelist, two recent novels, Sea of Puppies and River of Smoke, which are part of his Ibis trilogy. These are, I think, the most high-profile exploration of the 19th century migration in terms of cultural production coming out of the subcontinent. So this is distinct from the cultural production in the destination sites. I think we can locate the play today, Karuppi, is part of this constellation of cultural production from the subcontinent that explores the 19th century migration. To try and give you some historical context, some stuff around the cultural production, and what I think is a good turn, that now there's some reflection on this 19th century movement within the subcontinent, and not simply a celebration of the late 20th century migrations, which are presented by Bollywood, mostly as either highly successful restaurant owners or other, highly successful people who run around Saks Fifth Avenue, New York. So, some other kind of reflection of migration. So, just a few words about the play, and then we can just open it up, and I have a whole host of questions. It is, of course, a meditation on, and I think this is why it's kind of distinctive in terms of this new set of cultural products coming out. It's a meditation on movement, displacement, and the experiences of women. So it is the experiences of women that are at the center of this meditation. And I think as a consequence of this focus, it not only doesn't segregate those two migration streams, the state-managed one and the Kangani system, it's also able to link the 19th century movement to conflict-induced now. So I think it kind of is I think this is one of the great successes of the play, that it very smartly is able to draw links between, given this focus, is able to, sort of cross time and space to ask us to reflect on movement, displacement, and the experiences of women. I think this was also evident in one of the issues that it also will enable us to think about is to reflect on the continuities or the resonances between that 19th century migration and current regimes of labor. So there's, I think, not only the woman to whom the play was dedicated, Rizana Nafiq, who was executed by the Saudi state because the child in her care in Saudi Arabia happened to die, and she was held responsible for killing the child. But I think if you look at the nitty-gritty of how labor is conducted in sweatshops these days, and look at how domestic workers or care workers in general, the conditions under which they work, are quite similar to that 19th century migration. So this is, I guess, to warn against imagining that we have somehow got past the horrors of the 19th century, and to remind us that we have sufficient horrors today. And I think that's what the play, again, in its juxtaposition of different time periods, is able to do. So I'm going to stop there. I can begin with questions if there are none from the audience, but it might be good to open it up to other people. Go ahead.
Why was it different from the indentured laborers? How come it was different with the colonized Britain? How come they only did the northern part? How come the southern part was a completely different one? You said it was called a different thing.
No, they did do the southern part as well. So there was indentured migration out of Madras as well, managed by the state. It's just that the migrations to these closer,
It was only
the regional,
yeah.
So Sri Lanka, Malaysia, Singapore, Burma didn't come under that regime.
So they were dispersed to different countries versus the northerners went.
It's hard to make a clear distinction because I think people went from both the north and the south. And the Kangani system and the indenture system also coexisted for a little bit of time.
What's the
For a
Kangani
long
system?
period.
That's what I want to know.
The Kangani, okay, so before the state controlled migration, other entities controlled migration around the globe. So it might be a church, it might be all kinds of other middlemen. Someone was managing this. So if, not just in the north, so not only from the predominantly the port of Calcutta, but also the port of Madras, from which laborers went to South Africa, to Fiji, to the Caribbean. That part was still controlled by the state, but a whole other lot of movement was going on that was not controlled by the state. Now this doesn't mean that there was no system to it. The highly regulated system, it's just that it wasn't the state regulated.
So it was both the state and another system.
Yeah, there were two systems operating in parallel.
Thank you.
But and one of the women said she'd come from Russia. Was that, or did I hear that wrong?
So that was a poem written about basically in present day Sri Lanka, it's ongoing. Often Sri Lankan Tamil men in the diaspora find their right back home in the island, and they often have to make the journey across the world. And while they make that journey, because of various issues related to paperwork, they end up spending chunks of time in different countries. So the journey is usually broken up into little bits based on the paperwork. So this particular poem is about this woman who left Sri Lanka but had to spend 3 months, 3 months in Moscow, and it was a reference to her having to spend the night with the agent, who will then take her to the destination where her husband is, who she's already officially married to, but is not physically with yet. So it's an ongoing process that continues even today.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about translation, because it was mentioned at the beginning that the piece has been translated, and then also that I'm guessing it was translated into English and in Creole more recently, and I was wondering where the translations occurred and at what point and how they moved. Like, are the translations into English for an audience here, or was it translated into English when it was performed within the communities that were listed before, or how those translations played out and moved?
This is the second time I'm doing this play in English, or any political play in English. Usually most of the work is in Tamil entirely. And this play was specifically commissioned by the Tamil Studies Conference in Tamil. So it was written in Tamil, and in fact archival records that are in English were translated into Tamil and now retranslated back to the, not but whatever, the originals in English were used as they were this time. English translation is something that's come up because one happens to be here, but in the process of translation, one of the things that I think translating into English made easier to do was to include the Guyanese story, because the connection between communities in Tamil Nadu and communities that went to any of the ex-indenture societies are between Tamil Nadu and the ex-indenture societies are very flimsy right now. Much of that work, as Professor Mongia pointed out, still needs to be done in the cultural sphere, academic sphere, the works. So I think for us, that story was always important from the very beginning, especially with regards to worship practices, which have been carried on almost in pure form in some sense, quote unquote, but also equally mixed up at the same time. So I feel like the biggest contribution of the English translation was to make it easier to bring the Caribbean story in. And the second thing also is hopefully translation into English will make it accessible to different stories of different communities that have been displaced due to labor or war. We're not going out of our way to make that explicitly possible. I think we're still telling the story about Tamil-speaking women who went across the world, but hopefully saying it in English will make those connections more possible. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
So in terms of who translated it, it was the director and the person who compiled the text themselves.
Yes.
Aparna and then
Can you speak a little bit about your experience performing it in Sri Lanka with women, and just how it was received, how
Yeah.
it was
I think it's definitely by far one of the most sort of rewarding experiences that I've had as an actor. Also very challenging because you're acting like somebody and that somebody is in front of you, so you can't get shit wrong, because it is them. But I think it was interesting because in Jaffna, for example, I performed the play in a small, like, this women's group's office, and it was a mixed Tamil Muslim and Tamil Hindu audience from Jaffna. Either they stayed on or they had begun coming back. This was last year, so people have come, the Muslims are beginning to come back. And it was on Mosque Road, literally, where a large amount of people were driven out. And anybody here who knows anything about Sri Lanka will know that's the street I'm talking about. It's still destroyed, only one mosque has been rebuilt because lots of rich Muslims have been able to raise the money, but the houses are still destroyed. So we're in this room, it's this mixed audience, they're kind of sitting separate, not that they're fighting or anything, it's just out of habit of 30 years, right? So they're sitting, and then when I sit down to do my, whatever, half namaz, and I say, to thus, in Tamil, to thus dark, and through words boomed out from a megaphone, they knew what I was talking about, right? And then they were like, somebody's actually telling this story on the street loudly. Like, this is, and so I was like, should I stop? Like, what would be the best sort of ethical decision? I went on, of course, but that broke ice not only between me and them, but also in the room as well, because it brings up difficult conversations that are scary for me to say in Tamil Nadu. Bad things can happen to me, as the Tamil people in the room will know. So I think in Sri Lanka, with every town, there was such a localized reaction, because every town I went to also had a very different experience of the war. So Vaunia, for example, where the largest resettlement camp is, I performed it to a mixed gender audience of young men and women. And one of the boys said, when you asked us to write our names in the post-it notes, he felt like he was this generally sentimental, emotional, sweet boy, and he was like, nobody's ever asked me to decide that before. Nobody's asked me what I call myself before. I always heard what I am from other people, so it made me think about it. So everything was, and he grew up in the camp. He's as old as the war, as many of us are. Like, some of us were literally born in 1983. So and Colombo was a much more sort of intellectual or NGO audience, where there was a much more broad discussion about the whole country. The diaspora performance in Toronto was the most sentimental in the way that the diaspora can be, because the distance provides that space. In Sri Lanka, it's much more chop, 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 okay, you're telling this story, that story. In the middle of the plantation in Kandy, in central Sri Lanka, was definitely the most moving. It was in a Kali temple, literally, and the women were like, there were like a whole, like maybe 100 plantation workers who now work in garment factories and other things, because the plantations are getting privatized, etc., and who still don't have ID cards and kind of are in the same situation. So the ID joke worked excellently there. Yeah, it's true. I must get a birth certificate. Let me try again tomorrow to get a birth certificate from the Sri Lankan government. And there, they couldn't believe they were the heroines of the play, because they're never the heroines of anything. So I think the only thing they took away, who were like, oh my God, you were like plucking teeth. You know, we've never seen like anybody actually. So I think every place, and I'm not sure how to read performing it to an audience that's not who I'm playing. I did that only once in Madras, to a Madras audience who may think they are who I'm talking about, but they're really not, and that's my argument. And that itself already felt so distant, because I had just come back from Sri Lanka, and even Toronto, I was still talking about, the people I was talking about were still in the audience, in the diaspora. English is a whole other world. It feels more like a pedagogic tool. Hopefully we can use it to teach the history of indentured labor, which is so complicated, and sometimes articles are not enough, and books aren't enough. So maybe this can make the complicated connections. So every place is different. Sorry to ramble on, but everybody's different.
I'm going to take a new question.
No, mine is not a question as such, but I was really very impressed with the fact that you brought in Creole into the story, because one has been thinking simple-mindedly between vertical and horizontal dimensions of the diaspora, and in the horizontal dimension, Tamil diaspora globally, so to speak, I think these influences, inflections, which come from the locale where these people are located, become very important. And in a sense, you see people like Tejaswini Niranjana, who has talked about the mobilization of women in Trinidad and Tobago. I think the connection with India is only one of the connections, but it has become global, as need not be said in so many words. It is like that. And so I think what I feel is that the kind of performance that you give has the potential of really broadening and widening the scope of knowledge about diaspora. And we would very much welcome, not only in South India, in Malaysia or Sri Lanka, but in North India, for instance, you centers and courses on diaspora, etc. This sort of thing to be there more and more.
Yeah.
Why did the master want her to get a husband? In one of the things you said the master wants her to get a husband, and she said she didn't want to get married.
Sure. This is Veeramma, right?
Would be, yeah.
Yeah. Who didn't want a husband.
From inside India.
I think women who don't want husbands are very threatening. In the 19th century and today. For a woman, and of course we're laughing because I'm not sure why. Because it's actually a very serious matter, right? They're threatening to the social order. So of course the master wants her to be claimed by some man.
Oh, tamed by someone.
Claimed, tamed, the property of, I would, imagine. Now, there were very few women, by the way, who managed to make it without some nominal kind of linkage with some man. So, this was a story based in South Africa, and the scholarship on women in the indentured regime shows that they had to, keep sort of basically moving from man to man because they were not compensated enough for their labor. So you had to be, to attach yourself to some man, wash and cook for him, and thereby get some, sustenance, even though you were paid half the wages to work in the plantation. So. But I think the simple answer is that women who don't want husbands are threatened. I thought there was another.
May I ask my question in Tamil, if you don't mind, please?
Kandipa nichayam. I'll translate.
என்னென்னா நான் கேட்க விரும்புறது என்னன்னா அதெல்லாம் அந்த பிரேயரிங்காக ஜீவனீங்களாக இருக்க என்னுடைய வாழ்க்கை. ரெண்டாவது விஷயம் என்னென்னா இப்போ நான் இலங்கையில் பன்னியை சேர்ந்தோம். பெண்களுக்கு நிறைய அனுபவம் இருக்குது. குறிப்பாக அந்த பெண்கள் இஸ்லாமிய பெண்கள் அந்த மண்ணை திரும்ப வந்து அடைகிறாங்க இன்றைக்கு தாங்கி கொண்டேன். நீங்கள் அந்த ஒரு கதை சொல்லியிருக்கீங்க, அதை கட்டாயம் சொல்ல வேண்டியது. அதே நேரம் இன்னொரு விஷயத்தை சேர்த்து கொண்டால் இது ஒரு நிறைய கல்விமான்கள் இருக்கிற சபையினுடைய அதை நான் சொல்ல விரும்புகிறேன். சென்று சேரும். இன்றைக்கு டொரண்டோவில் தமிழ் ஊடகங்களில் தமிழ் பத்திரிகைகள் காட்டுகின்ற தமிழ் பெண்கள் அல்ல உண்மையிலே இருக்கிற பெண்கள். அது உங்களுக்கு தெரியும். நிச்சயமாக அது பெரிய பிரச்சனையாக இருக்குது. நாங்கள் எங்கள் புலம்பெயர்ந்த மக்களுக்கு ஒரு போர்வையை உருவாக்கி கூட அதனூடாக தான் தமிழர்களை காட்டிக் கொண்டிருக்கிறார்கள். தமிழ் பெண்களுடைய வழிகள் வேதனைகளை எல்லாம் சொல்ல வாய்ப்பில்லாத மாதிரி அவர்களை காண்பித்து கொண்டிருக்கிறார்கள். அது ஒரு முக்கியமான விஷயத்தை நான் மற்றது கட்டாயமாக நீங்கள் கூட முக்கியமான விஷயத்தை சொல்றீங்க. நீங்கள் விடுதலை புலிகள்லாம் அந்த இஸ்லாமிய சமூகத்திலேயே வேரோட கிளி அங்காளமுடைய வைக்க பண்ணினது என்பதை நீங்கள் இந்த நாடகத்தில் கலையா சொல்ல தெரிவிக்கிறது.
சொல்லிட்டேன் அனாரோட கவிதை.
அனாரோட கவிதையா சொன்னீங்களே தவிர
அவங்க இன்ட்ரடக்ஷன்ல சொன்னாங்க. தெளிவா அடியெல்லாம் வாங்கியாச்சு சொல்லுங்க. ஏன் கேக்குறீங்க? The first point was that we should add to the narrative that's presented in the play, to also add a point about the representation and the creation of the image of the women in the diaspora and how it often has to gloss over the various struggles and journeys that they themselves and other women who are still on the island are continuing to bear. And of course he also acknowledged Muslim Tamil women from where he's from, Vanni, are still scared to go back to their land, to their homes. Said should also clearly state that it was the LTTE who uprooted the Muslim community from northern Sri Lanka and put them elsewhere. To which I said there was a poem, and the introducer literally says in the LTTE they are sent to leave for 12 hours. Inside the play itself, to bring blatantly political sounding statements always weakens an artistic production, is our belief, all of us do. So the political statements, we believe, are much more potent if we use our art and skill to do it rather than to state in a sentence, which I and others do in articles. Everybody who's part of this feminist collective have written that and have had to face the repercussions of that. But in the play, I think when I sit down in an amas and talk about Northern Sri Lanka, people should know what I'm talking about. If they don't know, they should Google it. You know, so I think we don't want to compromise on the power of the art form by stating something literally. So that's why names of any kinds of oppressors are not there literally except for official states.
Thank you. That was an amazing performance. First of all, my question is, what type of research did you have to do before you came up with this play?
The person who put the text together, Gita, is an established historian of Tamil histories for the past 3 decades. So she's a very senior scholar who's been around and active for a long time. She's known this narrative and the story also for a really long time, but she's currently working on a much more comprehensive way of presenting it academically. And I think the play was one sort of stop on that journey, so to speak. I personally am a student of history. I'm doing a PhD now, and one part of my PhD, hopefully, is the history of indentured laborers. So as much, it wasn't the kind of project that included what we would consider extensive research. I think much of it is from secondary literature. Lots of the poetry are women poets who are very famous in the Tamil world. There's a whole other world of Tamil literature, which is very vibrant, and they are very famous poets in the community across the world. Almost all of whom we know personally, as we have a loose sort of network of Tamil women who try and bring our work together. Archival records are mostly stuff that's been inside secondary literature already or are available online. So yeah, I think the larger research is happening in the background. What's presented in the play is one snippet of what Gita has been working on for many years and what I've just begun working on.
Rosa, little louder.
The Zana Nafi. So according to the law in Saudi Arabia, if most people when accused of murder, the punishment for them is supposed to be death by execution. This particular young woman went as a domestic worker. So when she went from Sri Lanka, she didn't know she had to take care of a little baby, and she doesn't know how to. So when she got there, she was told to take care of this little baby, and because she didn't know how to feed the child and so on, the child died, unfortunately. And the parents and the police said that she was to blame. And according to law, the one way by which she could have been pardoned is if the parents of the child were to pardon her, and they didn't want to do that. And then there was a large international campaign. People from her village wrote letters to the Saudi government as well as the Sri Lankan government. Sri Lankan government intervened, asked for her pardon, etc. But they didn't back down on the punishment, and so she was killed.
How old was she?
When she went, she was around 13 or 14, so was a minor for 5 or 6 years. 6 years, so she must have been 8, 19.
And I guess, as I learned from Tony and Indu yesterday, she was in jail so that she would be an adult, because they couldn't execute her.
So she was 13 when she was accused of this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I guess from fake papers.
So a child.
Yeah.
We've been told by the organizers that we're just being allowed 1 or 2 more questions.
Any last words? anybody wants them back, we will take them, but I hope you say you don't want them. We have a huge collection now, something like 500, if not more, from all the shows. We have to do something with it, and everybody's asked. We're thinking about it in terms of some sort of an art installation that's easily movable, where we connect this history to the audience who are coming to watch the installation. But I'm not a visual artist, but we're collecting them and keeping them really carefully, and we will definitely do something.
Maybe I'll ask one question. I'm wondering if you can speak to this whole notion of the Tamil diaspora and who all it incorporates, what kind of themes it has, and because this is always a question around all these diasporas, whether it's Indianness or Chineseness or Tamilness. I'm just curious to know, what are the configurations of the Tamil diaspora?
Okay, so I mean, I think like all diasporas, it's a complicated one. Maybe one way to illustrate it could be the person who came to watch the play at the Tamil Studies Conference in Toronto, who was a descendant of plantation labor. His parents went as plantation labor from India to Sri Lanka, stateless, etc., the works. And he came up to me and was just so sentimental, being like, I've been to so many different gatherings of Tamil people in the city for many, many, many years. But I haven't heard our story of my ancestors be told in those forums. So like all diasporas, I think the Tamil diaspora also has its own exclusions and hegemonies, but coexisting with that is the reality of war and people having been forced to leave where they're from and so on. And then those are the Sri Lankan Tamils, but most people don't know. In Toronto, I find they don't know that there are Tamils in other parts of the world. For example, Madras in Tamil Nadu, nobody knows. So there you have the Brahmins who are computer engineers and go to Silicon Valley, etc. As you can see, I don't care about that. But it's important, it's part of the diaspora, and they learn Bharatanatyam and do fancy concerts in New Jersey. So there is that part of the diaspora, which is important or something. There are also people in Malaysia and Singapore. So I mean, I would kind of refrain, I think part of this, the effort with this play and much of our work is to sort of unpack the idea of Tamilness, including the diaspora, in a way where you don't separate it into so many bits that you can sort of never come together, but at the same time have a version of our identity as Tamil people, which is an inclusive one that espouses freedom rather than control. So where you can sort of reclaim your roots in a vibrant and nice way and be feminist and queer and still Tamil. And I think that reality is almost even more urgent in the diaspora than it might even be in the so-called home. So I think it's a multifarious and exciting field to work with. That's what's really quite exciting. Last.
Okay, yeah.
Very short. Any chance the play will be performed again in the Toronto area?
Nothing we know of right now, but yeah, we're open. I'm around. I can't go anywhere for 5 years.
Feel free to organize it. Well, I really want to thank Ponni for giving us the opportunity to see this magnificent production. I certainly learned a lot from it. I also, it's good to see things that connect with my research, because I don't work on cultural production, I work on law. So this is, for me, very enriching. Let's give her a very